President Donald Trump's second term has been defined by his inability to prevent the U.S. national debt from ballooning to a staggering $38 trillion, despite promises to restore fiscal discipline and strengthen the American economy. His failure to stop the debt spiral stems from a mix of structural economic realities, policy contradictions, and political priorities that emphasized short-term growth and electoral appeal over long-term fiscal stability. At the core of the problem lies the persistent imbalance between federal spending and revenue. During Trump's administration, expenditures surged across defense, infrastructure, and entitlement programs, while revenues lagged due to extensive tax reductions. The continuation and expansion of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a signature policy designed to stimulate business investment and household consumption, sharply reduced federal income while generating only modest economic growth. Analysts at the Congressional Budget Office estimated that these tax measures, combined with new spending initiatives, would add more than $3 trillion to deficits over the decade. Trump and his economic advisors justified the cuts on the supply-side argument that lower taxes would fuel sufficient economic growth to pay for themselves, but this prediction did not materialize. Economic growth remained moderate, inflation increased, and revenue shortfalls widened. Meanwhile, entitlement costs for Social Security and Medicare programs, politically untouchable for any administration, continued to grow as the population aged, consuming an ever larger share of the federal budget. Instead of introducing tough reforms to control these expenses, the administration largely avoided structural entitlement changes due to political risk. How did Trump's tariff policy go wrong? Trump's approach to the debt crisis focused on tariff-based revenue and economic nationalism. By imposing steep import duties, ranging from 25% to 100% on goods from China, the European Union, Canada, India, Brazil, and other major trading partners, the administration sought to raise customs revenue while protecting the domestic industry. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that Trump's tariff policies could yield up to $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. However, this potential was offset by retaliatory tariffs from trading partners, which reduced exports, hurt American farmers, and increased consumer prices at home. While tariff revenues did improve marginally, they were dwarfed by revenue losses from tax cuts and escalating federal spending. Trump also launched the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, a legislative package combining debt ceiling expansion with budgetary reform and selective cuts in domestic programs. The bill aimed to raise the ceiling by $5 trillion to prevent a government shutdown while introducing caps on Medicaid growth, regulatory cuts, and partial privatization of certain welfare programs. Yet, the very same act expanded defense spending and infrastructure investments, neutralizing much of its deficit reduction intent. The Congressional Budget Office later concluded that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act would add $2.4 trillion to the national deficit over a decade, underscoring the mismatch between the administration's rhetoric and fiscal results. Moreover, efforts to trim government employment, consolidate federal agencies, and curb non-essential spending, while politically appealing, had a negligible fiscal impact relative to the scale of the debt problem. How is interest on the debt consuming tax revenue? Interest costs further deepened the debt crisis under Trump. With the Federal Reserve maintaining higher interest rates to curb inflation, the cost of servicing federal debt rose sharply, nearly doubling from early 2021 levels. By mid-2025, annual interest payments alone exceeded $1.2 trillion, surpassing total U.S. defense spending. Trump's policies did not address this structural issue. Instead, continued borrowing at elevated rates amplified the compounding effect of debt growth. His administration's frequent clashes with the Federal Reserve over monetary policy added uncertainty to financial markets, prompting modest investor skepticism and driving Treasury yields higher. The 2025 Moody's downgrade of the U.S. sovereign rating from AAA to AA1 reflected these concerns, citing unsustainable fiscal expansion, elevated borrowing needs, and political resistance to fiscal consolidation. This downgrade raised borrowing costs further, worsening the very problem it sought to warn against. Trump's team countered that America's debt load was manageable due to its status as the world's reserve currency issuer, but economists warned that rising interest costs were consuming an ever larger portion of tax revenue, creating a feedback loop of borrowing to service past borrowing. Politically, Trump's failure to arrest debt growth also reflects a deliberate prioritization of short-term populist economic wins over unpopular fiscal austerity. His administration sought to shield voters from spending cuts while maintaining record-high federal investments in infrastructure, defense, and social programs. The White House routinely delayed or watered down budgetary reforms to avoid political backlash. Although Trump's Office of Management and Budget introduced a fiscal realignment plan in 2025 that aimed to freeze non-defense discretionary spending and reduce the federal workforce through attrition, these measures saved only about $150 billion annually, a fraction of what was needed to stabilize debt growth. Furthermore, the administration's trade conflicts and energy sector deregulation programs, while boosting specific industries, failed to translate into sustainable tax revenue expansion. The growth-first approach neglected the reality that economic booms alone cannot offset trillions in annual deficits when spending remains untamed. Trump's defenders argue that his administration inherited structural deficits, rising entitlement obligations, and a post-pandemic fiscal hangover that made stabilization nearly impossible. They note that defense spending was necessary to deter rivals such as China and Russia, while infrastructure programs aimed to revitalize American competitiveness. Yet, critics contend that Trump worsened the problem by rejecting bipartisan deficit reduction initiatives, resisting entitlement reforms, and relying on accounting optimism rather than credible consolidation. The Congressional Budget Office projects that under current Trump-era policies, U.S. debt will exceed 150% of GDP by 2035, an unsustainable level historically associated with slower growth and fiscal vulnerability. In essence, Trump's failure to halt the U.S. debt spiral lies in the contradiction between his fiscal messaging and economic governance. He promised to pay down the national debt within 8 years, yet his administration's policies, tax reductions without offsets, tariff-driven trade wars, expensive defense outlays, and politically motivated spending deepened the very crisis he pledged to solve. While some steps, like tariffs and targeted spending caps, were intended to improve fiscal discipline, they were overshadowed by the scale of tax losses, interest burdens, and political incentives to spend. The result is a debt mountain that now exceeds $38 trillion, a weakened fiscal position, and reduced flexibility for future governments to address economic downturns or emergencies. Trump's approach illustrates the enduring challenge of modern American governance, balancing economic populism with fiscal responsibility. His presidency exposed that without deep, structural reforms, particularly in taxation, entitlements, and spending discipline, no amount of tariffs, growth optimism, or political negotiation can reverse the U.S. debt trajectory. The combination of expanding obligations, high borrowing costs, and political unwillingness to impose sacrifice has ensured that America's debt burden continues to grow unchecked, leaving behind an economy stronger in rhetoric than in fiscal health. Thank you for tuning in, and I encourage you to subscribe to our channel for fresh content on crucial global matters. Additionally, please like the video and share your insights on the topic in the comments section below. Have a wonderful day.